So, hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. We're going to have a little conversation about somatic compersion. Um, and
Ah,
Alex, do you want to introduce yourself?
sure. I can do that. So I'm Alex Iantaffi. I use they, them, or him pronouns is okay too in English. And what do I do? Oh, I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. I'm also a sex therapist, a somatic experiencing practitioner, and clinical supervisor as well. And I write books and I host a podcast called Gender Stories. Located in beautiful Dakota Anishinaabe territories, currently known as Duluth, Minnesota. I'm looking outside to this pretty warm winter day for us. And I'm just really excited and grateful to be here with you, Mel, today.
Oh, it's so lovely to be here with you. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Mel. I am based currently on the Comox territories of Vancouver Island, BC. I am a somatic relationship coach. I work with the queer and questioning and those who love them, who are exploring consensual non-monogamy. And I'm a somatic experiencing practitioner in training. I'm in my last year of training for that right now. And I feel so thrilled to be with you, Alex, to like, as we were just talking about when we were getting things set up, this like lovely mycelial network of
Mhm.
connections and relationships. And it has just felt so lovely to be in these conversations with you and now to share these conversations with other people. And one thing I'm excited about to see is like how much are we going to end up talking with our hands? Because both you and I have that Mediterranean heritage.
Yes, I know. And then Zoom and Google Meet and all this platform has started doing the like fireworks and thumbs up. And so I'm like, I'm moving my hands about during like therapy or supervision, and all of a sudden it's like fireworks and thumbs up. So it'll be very exciting to see what happens.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh,
So folks who are watching us, I'm going to invite you to, if you have questions, just pop those in the chat. And also if there's any like technical things, if you're not hearing us, okay, anything like that, let us know.
mhm.
I'm actually just going to shuffle my chair back a little bit because the way that Instagram is putting us onto the screen,
Oh, yes.
I'm like,
Mhm.
I look a little too much.
Too
Um,
close.
my face, like no matter which way I play it, my Instagram just wants to make my face huge.
Alrighty. Well, I'm really excited for all the reasons you talked about, but also it's so exciting to talk to another somatic practitioner around all this kind of relational dynamics around consensual non-monogamy. And I think that some of what we're talking about really applies regardless of the relationship container, but it just feels so wonderful. And also we have some kind of shared identities and experiences, and I love that we've been like kind of geeking out on all the things, and now we get to share it with other people. And when you texted me, you were like, somatic compersion. I was like, yes, I have so many thoughts about this. And then we met and we're like, yes, we do have so many thoughts about this. So let's share them with the world.
So, for folks who don't know, how would you describe what somatics means?
Oh, that is a great question. Honestly, somatic, I feel like it's a word that's everywhere at the moment, but really, I think in its most kind of simple definition is of the body, right? The soma is the body, and it can be the individual body, right, or the collective body. I also like to think about the collective soma because we are co-regulating humans as humans. And so anything that kind of brings our whole entire being in, right, our whole entire body mind can be a somatic modality, right? And then somatic experiencing is its own kind of modality, kind of developed by Peter Levine and colleagues and it's his own approach. And of course, there are lots of different approaches to somatic. And it's interesting, I think. Sorry, I'm going on a total tangent here. I hope it's okay. I also think that it's interesting that all those somatic approaches, in a way, bring back a lot of indigenous knowledge back into healing. And of course, I've also appropriated a lot of those ideas from various kind of indigenous healing modalities. And I think it's really important to talk about that. Whenever we talk about somatic, it's not like from the brilliance of the cis white man, with all due respect to some of them who have been my teachers, I think that it is important to really acknowledge that there is kind of global wisdom from Indigenous community across time and space around how important bringing in the body and our whole body mind is for kind of any sort of healing and or relational processes too. I don't know, what do you think about that definition that
Yeah.
just gave you on the spot?
I love it. And for me, somatics is about how we come into cohesion, right?
Mm,
And I mean, my introduction to somatics comes through my practice in yoga and through my practice as a body worker. And I'm like a second generation body worker. So my mother was studying body work with a fellow called Jack Painter, who was a contemporary of Peter Levine, and whose student Deborah Anapol went on to
mm,
write one of the big books about non-monogamy. Um,
yes.
so there's a really interesting lineage of connection between somatics as a modern practice and non-monogamy. But um, I also think of it as like, a lot of what we think of as modern somatics was influenced by that cultural curiosity about yoga and
Mhm,
other embodiment practices through the 60s and 70s. And there's something about, yes, I think we can inform our practice of somatics from those indigenous practices, whatever our own lineage is. And there's something about, there's a potential in modern practices of somatics because we're facing situations that our ancestors didn't face.
mhm,
The ancestors who developed these practices for embodiment were not necessarily living under many centuries of colonial oppression.
mhm,
And so something I've, had to reconcile in my own self is the what modern somatics brings, or I think has the potential to bring, is something new to how we engage in relationships as we swim in the soup of colonialism and white supremacy culture and oppression. And as we've talked about, like the SE training
mhm.
doesn't necessarily go in that direction. But as it is so unavoidable now that we've been swimming in this soup for a long time, some of us have maybe been more aware of it for longer. I think there is a tremendous potential for these practices to teach us more about what it's like to be cohesive as people, like you're saying, like to be in your body, to be in your heart. I've been having a lot of conversations with folks recently about, like, in non-monogamy, we can get very intellectual about things.
Yes,
We love our frameworks, and those
we
frameworks are
do.
important because when we're stepping away from monogamy, we need to know what the F we're doing.
Mhm.
But there's also a piece of, we can get so caught up in the head and in the intellect, and we forget about the body, we forget about the emotions, we forget about our spirit. And for me, somatics is what brings that all back together.
Absolutely. And I love that you also mentioned that we are facing a different kind of set of circumstances that our ancestors did, because also, especially when I bring any somatic practices. Oh, I'm also trained in dance movement therapy. I forgot to say that. I was like, oh yeah, there's more lineages in there. And like one of the things that is different is especially white Anglo folks, like there is a freeze and a rigidity in the collective soma that is really very different than what our ancestors were engaging in when they were, you know, rooted in place and culture and language, not just language as in verbal language, but also like language, somatic language, right? Like knowing how to move individually and together. And I think we have lost so much of that. And especially, I agree that especially in kind of Western non-monogamous kind of circles, we can get so lost in what's the right way to do it, what are the rules, what is the right language, right? And then it's like there is this kind of neglecting of the nervous system. And I think especially when we're talking about compersion,
Yeah.
I think it's so interesting to kind of bring in the somatic perspective, to bring in the nervous system, to see how that might, you know, become embodied in a specific way. Yeah, I don't
Yeah.
know. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I agree. I think that the way compersion is often talked about is from that perspective of, well, you need to not feel jealous. And
Yes.
there's one right way to do polyamory and or non-monogamy in general, and you have to be magnanimous. You have to be gracious and generous. And if you feel jealousy, there's something wrong with you, you're broken, you're not
Mm-hmm.
cut out for this. There's a lot of weaponization of that. And I think we'll get more into like that enforced compersion piece.
Absolutely, which is really interesting because for me goes hand in hand with like white supremacy, right? And all the things from white supremacy culture that we can do. It's like the air we breathe, right? So it gets into our bodies and then into our relationships. And if we're not careful, it can really shape those relational dynamic. And so, yeah, I think that is so important to talk about this. Maybe for the folks, I had another thought. Also, it's really interesting because jealousy, I've been non monogamous for just over 25 years now. And jealousy was something that even 2.5 decades ago, you just couldn't talk about very much in polyamorous circles because it was bad, in air quotes, right? If you were jealous, you were like a bad polyamorist. And as somebody who has always experienced jealousy in my relationships, I even question, like, is this the right thing to do for me, even though I really wanted to um, I really felt I was like naturally non-monogamous, whatever that means, but also that I wanted to choose non-monogamy for a lot of reasons. So it was a both end, right? I felt a natural affinity with non-monogamy, and also then I had to reconcile what is jealousy, right? What does it
Yeah.
mean to feel jealous, and also distinguish, between jealousy and envy and unmet needs. And after 2.5 decades of engaging in this relationship, really realizing also how the relational conditions need to be there, like emotional safety and radical honesty and good communication for compersion to even be able to kind of be authentic and manifest in a relationship. I hope I'm making sense and not going like a little bit like all over the map. But yes, we should probably define what compersion is for folks who might not have come across it before.
Yeah. So compersion is a term that was coined by the Carista Commune, who were a polyfidelitous group that started, I think, in the 50s and 60s
Mhm.
in New York. And then they migrated to California and they had various community houses. There's a wonderful archives for the Carista
Yes.
Commune, which I love going through sometimes, just nerding out, and it's fascinating. Um, but they wanted to describe that feeling of positive empathy
Mhm.
that they were experiencing around feeling good about each other's relationships, feeling good about these shared relationships. And the wonderful Marie Thuin has recently written a book called "What Is Compersion," and it's a wonderful book that really goes into both like the research around the emotions, but also like the practical applications and the experiences. And she helped co-author what is now like the definition of compersion,
Mhm.
which I'm not going to quote it word perfect here right now, but it's the definition is no longer just it's about the wide range of positive emotions you can have about your partner being with someone else.
Mhm.
It's also the wide range of positive emotions you can have about knowing that good things are happening to other people. And I always
Yes.
think of like that sense when you see a couple walking down the street and you can tell that they're in love and you can tell they're having a great time and you're like, wow, that looks amazing. Or even when you hear a dear friend celebrating good news and you feel that sense of elation. And I
Mhm.
think that, well, we might get into like the different aspects of compersion, but I think that it can be not just an intellectual appreciation, but that we can have our own emotional joy around what's happening to someone else. And this is always made me think about like, what if compersion is just a natural state? It's not something that we have to acquire, which I think comes from that like colonial white
Yes.
supremacy thing of like, there's this thing I don't have and it's somehow out there and I need to like bring it into my experience. But that compersion is a very natural state of being, that it is
Mhm.
natural for us as humans to feel excited and warm and joyful about good things happening to other people that don't involve us.
And I think that is really beautiful. And I'm thinking about how much that kind of compression, like every other emotion, is embodied. All our emotions, right, start from the body first, and then we make sense of them. And I think we can have intellectual compersion. Like I appreciate like that my one of my partner's needs are met by this other person, but have a very different kind of somatic experience, which can give us a lot of information, right? I always like to say that emotions are not good or bad. Emotions are informations, right? And so even I know we talk about positive and negative emotions, but I think that's part of kind of how we've been colonized in a lot of ways to think about these are emotions that are acceptable and these are emotions that are not acceptable, right? And I love what you said that what if compersion was like really innate? What if compersion came from this feeling kind of abandoned and connected to folks around me in such a deep way that I don't think it's taking anything away from me. If one of my partner's needs are met, or if and it's not just about partnerships, right? Even as a parent, if my kids have other adults in their life who they can go to and feel emotionally safe to talk with, right? I have options here. Do I feel like my role is being taken away by somebody else? Or do I feel the abundance of community, the beauty of holding each other into this kind of broader mycelium of relationships, really? I don't know if I'm making sense. I'm like, my migraine med's very caffeinated today. So if at any point you're like, Alex, what are you even talking about? Please tell me.
I think you're making perfect sense. And I'm checking in on the Instagram comments and someone saying, "Hey, yeah, let's play." So I think we're both making sense, hopefully. If we're not,
Great.
people will let us know and they'll ask us questions.
Beautiful.
And
Yeah.
you're bringing in this piece around, we look at what are the characteristics of white supremacy culture
Mhm.
and that idea of scarcity, right? This idea that love is a scarce resource, I think, is something that we tackle a lot in non-monogamy, right? That's one of the pieces that we internalize from white supremacy culture and bring into our relationships, that connection is a scarce resource.
Yes.
And we know, you and I know that it's not, but it's another thing to know that intellectually versus to live that experientially. And there's so many things that can go into supporting us to know that experience. I mean, I think of like the early childhood attachment experiences that we may or may not have had can
Mhm.
influence how we experience the availability of affection, the availability of connection, the availability of relationship, and even the development in our nervous system of how we connect in with that relationality. So in what's called polyvagal theory, looking at the different parts of the nervous system, we don't have to get too much into the science of it, but the ventral vagal system is basically this front part of your nervous system that comes out from the base of your neck,
Mhm.
goes through your head, your face, and all your soft organs, all the soft part of your front, and all the way down into your genitals. And this system, it's there in all of us, but we may have different degrees of being able to access it. Like sometimes when you're scared, you don't necessarily notice what's happening in your heart or in your stomach or that you need to pee, right?
Mhm.
um and so that's the energy pulling away from the ventral vagal and going maybe more into survival mode. And when we are with someone that we feel safe and engaged with, and connected, we start to be able to tune into more of that. And we might notice that our breath slows down, We might notice it's easier to smile. We might notice it's easier to listen. And I know there's a lot that goes into that ventral vagal capacity. But what I think about is, when I'm feeling that true connection through my nervous system, I think of that as relationality. I have a lot more capacity for nuance. I have a lot more capacity for empathy. I have a lot more patience with my partners as well as myself
Yes.
and also strangers. Um, and it feels easier. It feels easier to be able to engage with things that might even be a little bit difficult, a little bit challenging, like my partner's not available because they're on a date with someone else. When I'm more connected to that ventral vagal capacity, there's a lot of stuff that just becomes easier because I'm not automatically seeing things as a threat.
Absolutely. And I love that you're talking about like all the beautiful things that we can experience when we are in that ventral vagal state, according to Stephen Porges' theory of the polyvagal theory, which has also been further popularized by Deb Dana. I always like to mention the names of the folks that like brought us some of those ideas. And so the ventral vagal state is everything you've described, but I'm also thinking about how hard that is to access for so many of us under capitalism, under white supremacy, right, under colonialism, because all of those systems are systems of constriction rather than expansion. And for me, like ventral vagal connection is so expansive, which is why, oh yeah, compersion can arise with ease when I'm in that ventral vagal state, right? Because I feel connected, I feel expansive, but often we live in a dominant culture that benefits literally financially from us being more constricted, being more self-policing, being right, just having this constriction, which is not conducive to kind of that level of ventral vagal connection, which then makes us feel like we belong. It makes us feel like intimacy, right? Not just kind of interpersonal intimacy, but even with the ecosystem around us, right? I find that often both myself and other people I know can more easily access that ventral vagal state with non-human animals or with nature, right? Like there can be much more of that expansiveness. And I think it's interesting that we're talking about somatic compersion at a time where this global rise of fascism and this kind of constriction that so many of us are feeling that sends us in those states of fight, flight, freeze, or fawn for survival, right? Where we cannot afford literally because like to feel that expansiveness because we feel like we need to kind of be ready, right, for whatever is like coming at us. I don't know. And so I'm really curious also about how this is impacting interpersonal relationships as
Yeah.
well as kind of, right? It impacts us individually, but I think it's really impacting the collective soma too, right? Whenever there's a crisis, collectively, that also impacts our interpersonal dynamics, I think. And so I wouldn't be surprised if people are finding it more challenging to access this kind of feeling of compression or state of, let's call it a state of compression, which to me really feels like a ventral vagal state,
Yeah.
really, which is then goes back to what you were saying, like what if compersion was our natural innate state of being, right? And there's been research that's shown that actually humans we do lean towards empathy because we are an interdependent species that actually enables our collective survival, right?
And I think we can see research that shows all mammals lean towards empathy. I
Yes.
saw a thing the other day. I didn't have a chance to read it, so maybe it was something AI created. I don't know anymore. But it was talking about a study of mice or rats that were trying to revive their companions who were not responsive.
Yes.
And, we look at this in animals too, like the cross species relationships, where I had a cat once who had a deer friend who he would always go play out with his deer friend.
Mm.
It was the sweetest thing. And, the mammals are mammalian, um, nervous system is
Yes.
wired for empathy and connection. And
Yes.
and then we land in this system of white supremacy culture, which really doesn't want us to be connected, which
No.
really wants us to be disconnected from each other. And the way
Mhm.
it does that somatically is by keeping us in a state of self protection. So instead of our nervous system energy going to that ventral relational piece, it pulls back away from there and it goes into the sympathetic nervous system, which
Yeah.
is what we think of as like the fight or flight. And, when there's a little bit of energy going on in there, we're excited. Like I feel my energy going into there right now. I'm like,
Mhm.
I'm on Instagram Live with Alex. We're having this juicy conversation. Yeah, like I can feel my body wiggling and moving.
Mhm.
And when that gets elevated, which it can from both good stimulation and not so good stimulation,
Absolutely.
we start to go into a larger expression of self protection, which might look like withdrawal from connection, or it could look like really powerful self assertion, like
Mhm.
control. I think of veto power as an expression of that fight response because
Absolutely.
it's like, I feel threatened. I'm going to try and control what's happening. But white supremacy culture wants us to stay in that heightened elevation of self protection because in that state, we no longer have empathy. We're no longer being relational. And if we stay in that as our baseline, which I think many of us experience, that is our baseline a lot of the time, especially if we exist in marginalized bodies
Mhm.
or oppressed bodies, then all it takes is a little bit more stress and we kind of cross a threshold where we go into shutdown. And what I
Mhm.
find is really interesting is in that space where we're about to cross that threshold, there's a part of the nervous system that wants to stay in connection. It's like we realize, oh shit, I'm about to lose connection. I need to drop everything I can to stay in connection right now. And that's where we go into people pleasing. That's where we go into fawn. That's where we become obedient to those
Yes.
systems of dominance. That is where we capitulate to what a partner wants and we abandon ourselves. And I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff we could unpack in there.
So
But
much.
what's happening in that, and you were the one who talked about this the other day, and I would love to hear more about this, like how sometimes the sympathetic nervous system puts on the costume of the ventral vagal.
Mhm.
So when we go into that people pleasing kind of space, we might think that we're being relational, but we're not actually.
Absolutely. And it was actually Kathy Kane who we both kind of started with for different aspects, who is a somatic experiencing practitioner and teacher, who first, at least I learned it from Kathy, and she talked about the sympathetic nervous system putting on the costume of the ventral vagal. And when she said that, I remember like my brain just going, it was like, it just made so much sense because she also talked about when we do that, when not only do we think we're connecting, but also we feel confused sometimes because it's like, oh, but I've spent this lovely time in community or I spent this lovely time with a partner. Why do I feel so depleted? Why do I feel alone? Right. And I don't know if you've ever had that feeling of like feeling alone in a crowded room as a neurodivergent person.
Oh
It's
yeah,
like the
I know
more
that
people,
feeling.
actually, the more isolated I feel. Weirdly, yes. But when she said that, it really helped me both personally and professionally, I feel, to really think about the sympathetic nervous system because I was like, well, you need that sympathetic nervous system, right? And especially before we had polyvagal theory, right? How do we kind of mobilize to connect with others otherwise? But then as intimacy deepens and as we feel more comfortable, right, the ventral vagal state doesn't require effort. That is the difference, right? When we're in a ventral vagal state of connection, I believe like we are accepting ourselves and each other. And so there is an ease that is just not there when the sympathetic nervous system is trying to do or pretend to do the job of the ventral vagal system, because of course it can't, right? It's like oh, it's like all those movies. There's a lot of tropes, right, about age swapping when the child isn't like the adult body and the right, and the adult is in the child body. And it's kind of like that, I feel, when the sympathetic nervous system puts on the costume of the ventral vagal, right? It's like a little kid is putting on, like, grown up clothes, and it's like, I'm a grown up, I can manage this. And I don't know about you, but even in my 50s, sometimes I'm like, who put me in charge? This was a terrible idea, right? Who made me an adult? Like, what is happening, right? In some moments, because it's a lot. Adulting under late stage capitalism and the fall of empire at the moment, it's a lot, right? So that, of course, we're going to feel those things. But when we're in that ventral vagal state, there isn't any pretending. There isn't any effort because we can just exist, right? It's that state where, oh, I can be with somebody and we don't have to talk and there is ease. I don't have to worry about where they're not talking to me. Like, are they upset with me? Like, what's going to happen, right? Which I know, as somebody who lives with complex PTSD, is very easy to spin out on people's silence for me. But I know when I feel that emotional safety, then my ventral vagal system really kicks in, and I'm like, I feel no pressure to talk or for the other person to reassure me, right? I can just exist and coexist.
Yeah.
And it's really beautiful, but I think it's really hard to access in a kind of white supremacist colonial system because we're so not used to it. And also because we can only find little pockets of relative safety where we can experience that, right? We cannot just experience that in the world day to day because of how the world is. And so it becomes extra important, I think, for our nervous system to find those pockets of relative safety, because literally that's also where the nervous system recharges,
Mm-hmm.
right? And where our spirit, I also think, I believe, recharges and feel it's the place where we feel, oh, we're not alone. I'm
Yeah.
not alone. And I feel more resilience because all of a sudden it's not just about my individual resilience, but it's about our collective
Yeah.
resilience. And I can experience, not just appear, but I can feel in my whole body mind that I am not alone. Because I can say I'm not alone, but it's very different than feeling it. I don't know.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. And that joining and connection, like I
Mhm.
think of, I mean, I think it's important to acknowledge, like, we're talking about these different parts of the nervous system, and it's not a zero sum game. Like, it's not like
Mhm.
I'm fully in my ventral or I'm not. I think of it as like you have three cups and you're pouring the same amount of energy into these three cups. And maybe some's going into the somatic, I mean, sorry, into the sympathetic. Maybe some's
Authentic,
going
yeah.
into the ventral. There's also the dorsal system, which is that back part of the nervous system, which is our like freeze response, which is like, I'm done. I'm toast. I need to,
Mhm.
blue screen comes up on the computer. Like, we need to reset everything. And I think a lot of us have been touching on that in the last few weeks. I say that as someone living in Canada. I've been feeling that too.
Yeah.
But I think when well, I should put it this way, the more capacity I have to access my ventral vagal, the more I notice that I have capacity for nuance. The more I notice I have capacity to put myself in someone else's shoes, so to speak. Whereas when my sense of relationality is coming from the sympathetic nervous system, pretending to be relational as a survival strategy, because it's great at doing that,
Oh, yeah.
um, it feels more like there's like a veil between me and the other person. I am very connected to myself in that moment, but I might also not be connected to how I'm responding to what's happening. And I find that, if I reflect back with the wisdom of age, on some of my early polyamorous experiences, I think there were many moments where I was in that sympathetic, attempting to be relational. And then when something unexpected would happen, I could feel everything tighten up. I could feel that impulse of like, I just want to kick and scream. I just want to have a tantrum about this.
Mhm.
And I can't do that because then I will not be a good poly person. And I need to find compersion for this. And that was such an interesting thing for me because at first I had a very easy time finding compersion. And what I experienced was not so much jealousy as suddenly I was like, I don't feel safe. Suddenly everything feels like it's an existential crisis. And I can know intellectually it's not an existential crisis, but something in me is acting and reacting as if it is. And I think that's because I was just hanging out in that sympathetic state.
Absolutely. And I think that that is so interesting because I don't know about you, but for me, oh, I have so much to say about this. There's a piece that's also about gender for me, right? There's this expectation that I was brought up with because of my gender assigned at birth of like, being pleasant and attending to other people's needs and prioritizing other people's needs, right? And the motion and this idea that, right, if I'm a good girl, in air quote, that was my survival strategy growing up, right? Then I would be safe, right? And so comparison can easily become part of that for me. And especially at the beginning, I'm like, am I just a bad polyamorous person? Why can I not access this? And one of the things I was living in the UK when I began kind of my journey and non-monogamous journey. And one of the things that I realized, I was like, oh, hang on a minute, there is dissonance and my nervous system is feeling the dissonance because sometimes because I could do that up to a point, but I was also brought up in a culture where it was okay to show my emotions and it's okay to be emotional. It's okay to like cry if there is a strong emotion, right? I remember being at like a professional meeting in Europe and I was so embarrassed that I cried during a really intense discussion. And then one of my colleagues who was a little bit older than me, was Italian as well, was like, what's going on with you? Like, why are you so upset about the crying afterwards, one on one, right? I was like, oh my God, I was just like so unprofessional. And it was like, that was a completely coherent response to the situation.
Yeah.
You've been living in England too long, right? And I was like, I sure have. And so even when I go back back home to Italy, right? Like the home that my body knows the best in terms of rootedness, there is like an expansion and the level of ventral vagal connection that is very hard for me to experience in kind of Anglo-Germanic, Northern European and Northern American countries, right? Because of that, often there is this kind of, am I really seeing what I'm seeing? And then if I show you what I'm feeling, this might seem like a level of vulnerability to you that you interpret in a different way. Because it was, this is kicking up something else you said. Sorry, my brain is doing that ADHD thing of like, I have 500 things that I want to say about this. But yeah, anyway, jump in. So,
Well, well, yeah, I mean, I can really relate to that. I
mhm,
think that there is something about, again, going back to that like white Anglo colonial construct that doesn't want us to have emotions, that wants to have a
yes,
lot of control over emotions. And we
yes,
see that in, the conventional gender narratives that girls are expected to have this kind of emotions, boys are expected to not have emotions, and this is again a whole other conversation for another time, but that like the ventral vagal connection for a lot of boys growing up is like you can connect to your throat and you can connect to your genitals, but you're not allowed to connect to anything in between, and that's why you need a female partner to do that
mhm.
connection for you.
Unless it's sports or fighting,
Yes, right.
right?
They're allowed the anger slice of the emotion wheel.
Yes. So,
And of course, we know that how harmful that is.
mhm.
But I also really relate to what you're saying. I mean, I grown up as a third culture kid.
Yeah.
My mother is Greek, but culturally she's Latina. She grew up in South America, and my father is English Irish, very English in his manners and his emotional connectivity. Um, And I grew up in the Middle East. And so, the cultural influences for me are also those cultures where it's like, I'm going to be big in my emotions and I'm going to say what I think. And yeah, I'm going to cry in the middle of the day, in the middle of the street. And that's okay.
Yeah,
And then living in Canada, which is very, the dominant culture is very white, very colonial. And I think the Canadian politeness is like a whole other level of things there. There's a culture of we have to keep our emotions under control, and I'm a big Star Trek fan. I always love to bring in Star Trek references. We're not Vulcans.
yeah,
And, even in Star Trek, they've explored like Vulcans aren't lacking emotion. They have strong
exactly.
emotions that sometimes come up to the surface. And I think that going back to this piece of like enforced compersion, right? This idea that we can control our emotions, that we are somehow dominant over our own emotional states. And it is very scary if you're unfamiliar with an emotion and
Mhm.
you feel it arising and it feels like it's going to take over, especially if that emotion is related to an impulse, right? In somatic experiencing, we look at what is the impulse that comes with a sensation. And I think, like a really strong emotion like anger or rage can feel very scary if we're not familiar with what to do with it because we're unskilled with our rage. We don't know how to channel it. We are afraid of the harm it could do, which, yeah, it could do harm if we don't know how to be with our rage. And so, this idea of like we can control our emotions, we get into that with like we can control who we love. I see a lot of people fall into that fallacy. We can control who we're attracted to. We can control who we experience jealousy of. We can control our compersion. This idea that we are in charge of our emotions is coming from that white supremacy control piece. And
Mhm.
it's one of those pieces that I think bleeds over from mononormativity into non monogamy when we think my partner needs to stop feeling jealous, or my partner's emotions are things that are too big for me to know how to deal with. And so I want to shut them down. So we dismiss or minimize. And what we do is we actually start to put all our emotions in boxes that we lock away. And I think when that happens, we lose that ventral vagal connection. So it
Oh,
becomes this like
absolutely.
self-perpetuating thing. And then we try to force ourselves to feel compersion when we have no ventral vagal connection.
Or we pretend we feel compersion, but it's really an intellectual exercise, and then those feelings come out sideways, right? Which is also interesting because what I find is like, so many things to say here. First of all, this idea that we can, the mind over matter, right? That we can control our emotions and that our prefrontal cortex is like superior almost, like, and can manage all those emotions is so deeply, I think about it as the fascist within, right? It's
Yeah.
like, this is how we're going to run things, and this is acceptable, and this is not acceptable, right? And so already there is a rigidity to that, right? And this is the right way of doing things, this is the wrong way, and also brings up this idea that if you express emotions in a certain way, if your facial expression is coherent with your emotion, which actually in somatic experiencing means that we are, there's good body mind connection, right? Like if I feel anger, but I talk about it like this, that I feel angry, but I'm talking about it like this, that first of all, that is a form of cultural gaslighting, even as a parent, right? It's like, let me hydrate for a minute. It's like how our kids are going to learn how to manage the challenging emotions, how to manage anger, if they've never had kind of that modeled in a healthy way by adults around them, right? Because
Yeah.
that it's we learn how to kind of contain our own emotions and how to self-soothe. by co-regulating with adult kind of nervous system around us when we come into the world and we grow up. And so if there is this dissonance already, that is kind of almost like a form of gaslighting and caregiving, but it's also gaslighting in kind of our interpersonal relationships, right? Because I'm saying one thing, but I'm feeling another. And then my nervous system is sensing one, is having one experience, but our talking and what we're saying is not connected to the nervous system experience I have. And I don't know, maybe it's just me and my neurodivergent autistic ADHD brain, but now all of a sudden I'm incredibly confused.
Yeah.
And then there is the other layer that emotions cannot be separated by language and culture, like you said,
Yeah.
right? So sometimes when I'm just a little bit upset and frustrated, Anglo folks might think that I'm really angry. I mean, I live in the Midwest and so-called Minnesota, very similar to, Canadian niceness. And so if I am showing even the little bit of frustration, I must be really angry right inside. Because here, culturally, white folks wouldn't even show anything until it's untenable, right? Whereas I'm
Hmm.
like, I don't know, just be a little bit pissed off or a little bit frustrated. But then it gets interpreted as in like, you must be furious. I'm like,
Yeah.
no, really. Or if I'm expressing like emotional closeness, that might be seen as in kind of too much, right? Too much, too enveloping. Whoa, I need to protect myself from that, right? This idea of protection. And so under those conditions, it's really hard, I think, to experience that somatic full compersion, let's call it, rather than just an
Yeah.
intellectual compersion. Sure, I can be happy that my partner is with somebody else who's meeting their needs and they're having a good time, but can I really feel it? Or um, am I disconnected from it because of culture? Because maybe actually my needs are not getting met in my relationship, but I'm trying to pretend it's okay. Or maybe I'm not feeling emotional safety because there's also this other piece of not only do we police ourselves by each other,
Yeah.
right? And it's so that, I mean, I see this all the time as a family therapist and couples therapist, right? The fingers are always pointing at each other, not at ourselves,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? And when we are so focused on what our partner is doing, right, then we're not focused on like, am I being an emotionally safe partner? How am I showing up? And if I'm not, is there because the conditions are missing? And we can't force people to feel compersion, and also not feeling compersion doesn't mean I don't love this person or that I don't care about this person or that intellectually I don't feel it. It's just something else is taking away
Yeah.
from this more deeply connected ventral vagal experience. I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I love that we're getting to touch here on the obstacles to compersion from a somatic perspective. You're touching on the lack of emotional safety. And I think it's important to recognize that could be real or it could just be perceived, right? It
Absolutely.
doesn't matter how true that is, it's how you experience it, because that's how your nervous system is going to be responding. There's a lovely comment in the chat here on,
Mm-hmm.
on Instagram. Thanks to you both for your open tears and emotions. So validating. Well, thank you.
Oh,
Yeah, we're big fans of emotional expression around here. Um, but coming back to like these obstacles to compersion, the one I love to play with is framing it as jealousy, but not spelt the way we normally spell it in English. So in somatic experiencing, there's this concept of global high intensity activation. So GHIA. And so I put that together to be jealousy.
nice. Mm-hmm.
And what that represents is there is a disrupted process of
Yes.
finding safety. You're not able to know if you're safe. So, like, if you've had a car accident, I had a car accident a few years ago where I spun out on the ice and my car went ping ponging from one side of the road to the other. I was fine. Toyota Echo's well built. Um, but there was a moment after all that spinning where I was just stopped and holding the wheel and needed to take a breath to go, what just happened? Where am I? Am I here? Am I alive? Am I injured? How's the passenger with me? Are we in danger being on the road where we are? There were all these pieces that my brain was trying to process in that moment. And before I had actually ascertained, yes, I am safe. Yes, traffic has stopped for us. There was a lot of panic going on. And that moment of panic is because I cannot orient to where safety is.
Exactly.
So that is the experience of disrupted orienting. And in non monogamy, most of us are coming into it from a background of monogamy. We may not necessarily know what to expect. We don't know which way is up. I think this is one of the reasons why
Hmm.
we get into so much framework and lingo and everything, because we're trying to orient. But if we're in any kind of situation in our relationships where there's ambiguity, there's a new connection, we don't know what it is yet. My partner hasn't called me after their date. What's going on? What does that mean? We will experience in our nervous system a lack of safety, a lack of being able to know what's happening. Suddenly, our sense of certainty in the future of a relationship can feel like it's on tenuous ground.
Hmm.
And that leads to that sympathetic nervous system activation. So we start to get more self
Absolutely.
protective. We start to get a little more controlling. We start to pull away from that ventral vagal relationality. And I think that is the biggest obstacle to compersion. We tend to focus a lot in poly spaces about talking about like the logistics of compersion. And
Hmm.
I think there's value to that, but I'm so much more interested in what's happening in my nervous system that is creating an obstacle to compersion. And what happens if my relational needs are met for safety in a different way? What happens the moment my partner does call me and was like, hey, I'm sorry I was late calling you. I just got carried away. I love you. I had a great time. As soon as I hear that, as soon as I know what's going on, I have so much more access to relationality, to feeling safe, and to feeling compersion.
And that's a beautiful example because, oh, I have so many thoughts. First of all, I think we often, instead of orienting, we try to control.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So there's a difference, right? I love like going back to that moment in the car, right? You're holding on to the steering wheel, car stops spinning, and you're like, okay, what the fuck just happened, right? Orienting means I'm looking around and I'm assessing all those things that you talked about, right? And similarly, in our relationships, we're constantly orienting ourselves to the relationships, to one another, but often we stay with that feeling of fear and then the control comes in, right? And so in non-monogamy, then you find things like contract, veto powers, right? And I'm one of those folks who's like less interested in written contracts in non-monogamy and more like absolutely there need to be some clear agreements. But I'm like, let's really start from like values and intention and then let's line up your actions, right, with your values. Because if we start from these are the rules, right, and then we're going to write these rules and we're going to make a contract, as we enter a non-monogamous relationship. Well, for me, that is, first of all, it's applying a very colonial monogamous contract of um, ownership and control, right? Like we have rules rather than what are our values, what are our intention, where is our care? How are we going to care for each other, right? Because first of all, there's no amount of rules or contracts in my experience, not just my personal experience, but also as a therapist, my experience that is going to count for every situation,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But if I'm well oriented to what my partner needs and what I need, and also the moment, there are folks who like, throw new information in a non-monogamous relationship like a grenade, right? You're having a conversation that's about something else, and then boom. Oh, by the way, I've been talking about with this person for like a few months, and I just had a great video call with them, and I'm like, and plus, if you add neurodivergence on top of that, right, it takes me a moment to process and orient myself to the situation. And then if there is this expectation, well, how do you feel about that? Right? Because now I feel entitled to compersion. And if I don't get your compersion, right, you're a bad partner because why can't you be happy for me? Right. And I've seen that play out in my own relationships. I've seen it play out in clients' relationships, right? When we feel entitled to something,
Yeah.
first of all, no, nobody's entitled to your compersion. I want to say that out loud because I think we put so much pressure on ourselves and our partners. It's like compersion is beautiful and I want to experience it not because it's something that my partner expects of me or the non-monogamous community or the polyamorous community expects of me, but because it's really a great ventral vagal state and it's in line with my values. I want to experience it. So when I don't experience it, it's not because I don't want to experience it, it's because something else is going on, right? I might need a minute to orient myself. I might need a moment to say, oh, can we talk about this another time? Or I might even be like, I am happy for you. And I'm also having some other feelings that I want to sit with because maybe our relationship is not in a good place or a good enough place where I can feel that expansiveness, right? Maybe already I'm like hyper vigilant because there are things that are not going smoothly. And so in that is I think when we can weaponize, I mean, we can weaponize anything. I've seen nonviolent communication being but weaponized in very violent ways, especially versus white women, but not only. And compression can be weaponized too, right? This is my right in a non-monogamous relationship. Why are you not happy for me? I'm like, that's more complex than that. I don't know. How is that resonating for you, Mel, in this moment?
Oh yeah, I've had those conversations. And I mean what you're bringing up here, it makes me think about, in somatics, and this is something else I've heard from Kathy Kane, going at the pace that we can digest and integrate an experience. And I think in non-monogamy, we need to recognize anytime there is a new relational dynamic in that ecosystem. I like to think of it as an anercule. Some people call it a
Mhm.
polycule.
I
You
love
know,
anarcho.
anytime there's a new relational dynamic, there is stimulation. And
Yes.
stimulation is a very neutral way of saying there's new energy and we don't know what it is. And so our nervous system might experience that as some stress. It might experience that as like we need to elevate our awareness. We might feel a little more vigilant or a little more curious, depending on where we're at that day. And,
Hmm.
when someone goes at a new relationship really quickly, then there's a lot of new information to take in. And depending on our own individual nervous systems, depending on the day we're having, depending on what other life stress is going on, depending on the fall of empire, all of these things, we may have more or less capacity to put towards digesting and processing and integrating this new information. And I think of like, I see a lot of people try to navigate this with like a don't ask, don't tell. Like, I just don't want to know what's happening. But I think that then plays into the like, let's push away our emotions piece. And
Absolutely.
there are
Hmm.
times where that is helpful. Like if you're going through something like you're going through a life risk surgery or something or other, fair.
Yeah.
You want to have a compartment around what information you take in. That is really good looking after your nervous system. But in general, how do we create spaces in our relationships where we can slow down so that we're going at the pace of being able to integrate that new information so that we don't lose connection to that feeling of connectivity. Like Jessica Fern talks about this in Polysecure, this quality of turning toward.
Yes.
And I think that is such an important piece, that we might connect with other people, but we also connect back with the people who are already in our lives. And I think of this in terms of the heart as a muscle. And, when you want to build muscle, you don't just contract, you also have to stretch. And it
Exactly.
is the movement of fullness, the full movement. You go to the full range of motion. That is what helps to build muscle. So when we think of our emotional muscles, I think of it as we need to be able to explore what is it like to show up fully in presence with one person and then show up fully in presence with another, or at least as fully as we have the ability to do so in that moment. because I don't want to
And
get into like, you're not showing up fully enough with me.
oh,
But
which that can be weaponized too. Absolutely.
yeah, people weaponize, you're not being relational with me.
Hmm.
But I think what that does create space for is that we get to move towards more safety. Like
Yes.
we know objectively safety is not a finite, it's not like an absolute,
Mhm.
it's relative. But I think holding that curiosity of how do we move towards more relational safety when these things are happening, when we're feeling stressed, when there's a new dynamic. Because I think moving towards that, that's the attunement. That's the co regulating in our nervous system. That's the coming out of sympathetic activation and back into ventral connection so that we can have more possibility of accessing compersion.
Absolutely. And I'm aware of time, but it feels really important to say also that when we are in that fight, flight, or freeze or fawn, we have to be focused on ourselves for survival. It's not about selfishness. It's not about other words that I see thrown around a lot nowadays, like narcissism and other stuff. It's really about survival. Like when we are in survival mode, which fight, flight, or freeze or fawn are survival responses, of course we're focused on ourselves because it's me or the world, right? I'm under threat. And so I'm not going to be able to experience compersion if I feel that way. And so partially is also how do we do our work to know our own nervous system, right? Because if I'm entering from this place of even if I'm trying to connect to a partner or reconnect to a partner after being with another partner, but I'm coming from the space of fight, flight, or freeze or fawn, that is not going to allow me to connect, right? It's like, or I can have some connection. We go back to that idea of the sympathetic nervous system putting on the costume of the ventral vagal. And so actually, it is really, there are a lot of different conditions that need to be met for that somatic compersion experience, which can be not only beautiful, but also healing. Like,
Yeah.
I think when I can really experience that, it just heals something in my own soul. It heals something in my own attachment. It heals something in the relationship between us, right? And even in the collective soma, right? And I think that's true whether it's like people are in monogamous relationships, but also for people who are in monogamous relationships and might feel in competition with somebody's job or somebody's friends or somebody's hobbies, right? Because
Yeah.
the reality is that even monogamous folks have other things they love apart from their spouse, I hope, or partner, right? Like, and so, or even with our kids, right? I see so many parents and caregivers really struggle feeling compersion for their kids' happiness as they become young adults
Yeah.
and become themselves and have their own lives, right? Because there's so much fear. What is being taken away from me? But if we feel like nothing is going to be taken away from me, that there's just more abundance in the mycelium, and I can access it too, right? Because I'm in this place of expansion and ventral vagal connection, and that's compersion to me. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think we're touching on two things here. Like one is that compersion is not static. It's not like you get to this place of compersion and then it's permanent. And
Yes.
again, I think that sense of permanence comes in from mononormativity. It's part of the monogamy hangover. It's part of white supremacy culture. That compersion is dynamic. It's like
Mm-hmm.
we might have more of it or less of it, and that's okay. But what I think is really interesting here is we're talking about applying anti-oppression principles
Yes.
to the way that we engage in relationships, right? When we look at anti-oppression frameworks and putting anti-oppression into practice, there's a lot around how do we slow down? How do we recognize the needs of everyone in the room? How do we widen systems of support, whether that is through mutual aid or through enhancing the relationship ecosystem? How are we deepening that sense of attachment and connection? These are all parts of that come into
Yeah.
anti-oppression work. And I think this is where I get really excited. I get chills up and down my spine. Thinking about the exploration of compersion from a somatic perspective has the potential to do so much for us on a interpersonal level when we are engaging in anti-oppression work, when we are going with these questions of how do we survive in systems that want to oppress us, that want us to be in sympathetic survival state or shut down, and how do we maintain relationships? How do we regrow relationships that may have been fractured through these systems of oppression? And I love that, you know. I say this in my book, something along the lines of like, I'm not sure if non-monogamy is going to save the world, but like, what if we just try this out? Like, what if we take the principles that we learn from non-monogamous relationships and explore what it's like to put this into all of our ways of relating? What might happen? I don't know, but like, it would be fun to find out, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. I'm definitely not one of those people that is like non-monogamy is for everybody. I'm not a non-monogamy evangelist. I like to think about it. And there are some, and I know you're not either, but I love this idea of like, well, what is it that all the different ways of beings can teach us, right? Same as in like, I think that queerness can teach a lot to like non-queer folks. And I think non-monogamy brings really this beautiful sense of love, not as a finite and scarce resource, right? And I love that, which is why I'm always like, my writing partner, who you know as well, MJ Barker, and I always try to write in this more global way because there's a part of me that's like, I want to bring these principles, like no matter what your relationship container is. And so just because you're monogamous doesn't mean that you can't feel compersion, right? It's like if you are monogamous and your partner loves to go foraging and you feel compersion when they go foraging because you know how much pleasure it brings them, whereas something else brings you pleasure. That's compersion. And isn't that beautiful that we don't have to control each other or make each other less or feel entitled, right, to every aspect of somebody else's life, right? That there can be this just expansiveness. And yet, I also feel like we need to be gentle and slow with ourselves and not just like beat ourselves up and like I should feel compersion. Compersion is good for me, right? I'm like that's not going to
Yeah.
work, right?
Yeah.
It's like no, it's just like oh, if there are obstacles on the way, what are those obstacles, right? Is there something in the interpersonal dynamic? Is it something to do with my healing? Is it both? Is it the world is on fire and we're all activated? Like, right?
Yeah.
And to just be able to approach this with as much non-judgment and compassion for ourselves and each other as we can, which is not always easy. And I know I am not always good at it. That's why it's a practice, right? But I agree. I think it's a beautiful state that I wish for everybody. Um, and also that it's okay to invite ourselves into compersion rather than force ourselves into compersion because our body minds, I don't think they're just going to constrict if we're trying to force them into something, right?
Yeah.
Like somatically, we can't expand if we feel pushed towards
Yeah.
something.
And I think, you know, there's that principle of like it is very radical to step into a way of relating where we're not forcing, we're not pushing. There is so much we have learned about how to function in the world, which is let's push, let's
Yeah,
force. I'm not going to be hurt unless I push. I have done this a lot.
same. Yeah,
And to explore, I think it's about holding curiosity rather than trying to push ourselves.
yes.
I like to think of it as like, let's hold curiosity. Let's be curious about what might this be like to move towards something. Maybe I don't get there. I don't know. Or maybe I
Yeah,
get there. Maybe there is a permanent state of compersion, and that's what enlightenment is all about. I don't know yet.
amazing. I haven't reached it yet, if there is, but
But that doesn't stop us from holding that curiosity and looking at, yeah, the obstacles to compersion are this sympathetic activation. So what's creating sympathetic activation? How can I create more capacity in my nervous system so that even when I experience sympathetic activation, because that is a normal survival response, it is a
absolutely.
healthy response, even when I feel that, I don't have to stay there. I can move out of that. And that's to me what somatics makes possible, like somatic experiencing and also somatic movement. Like I think there's so many principles
Mhm.
that help us to create that resiliency, that flexibility, that we're not static, we're not stuck. I see someone mentioned
Mhm.
in the comments earlier, like, yeah, compersion is definitely not static, and we are not static as human beings. We
Mhm.
we might try to pretend that we are because that feels safe, but change is constant.
Oh,
And
yes. Hmm.
someone asked in the comments earlier, what book would you recommend for learning more about polyvagal? And there are some great books, but I I,
Hmm.
I would say the best way to learn is to experience. The books can help you with a framework and an intellectual understanding of it. But the best way to learn this is to put it into practice and to discover what a difference it makes. When you
Absolutely.
start to feel in yourself, oh, this is what it feels like to have ventral vagal access. Oh, this is what it feels like when my body is shut down. Oh, this is what it feels like when I'm scared and trying to hide that and stay in relationship. The more self-awareness we have, to me, that's self-partnership, is like you're working with yourself instead of against yourself.
Exactly.
Um, I think that the more you get to really actually put this into practice in your relationships.
And I love that you mentioned self partnerships because, in a way, it's like that deepening somatic awareness enriches the relationship with ourselves, right? And so, and that, like, if we can approach ourselves with like that gentleness, that curiosity, if I can turn towards myself as well as turn to, not in a survival way, but in a curious way, and then turn towards my partners again, there is that kind of flow, right? And that ease that comes. And I agree that there's some lovely stuff from Dana on polyvagal theory, but really it's the experiencing that expansion and contraction that is part of who we are, right? Our heartbeat expands and contracts. Our breath is expansion and contraction. And also, we cannot live in ventral vagal connection at all times. But when you experience it, you'll never forget it. I remember at the end of my advanced training for somatic experiencing, I had this moment where we were doing this exercise in small groups, and I looked around to orient myself, and I looked at all these people in the room. And I think for the first time in my life, I was like, I have a felt sense of safety with all these other humans who I don't necessarily like everybody in this room because that's human, and that's okay. And I don't have a sense of absolute safety with everybody in this room, but in this moment, I feel just this state of like safety and ventral vagal connection, and that is life changing. And so, yes, like no, I think the books can help us give a framework, but like that felt sense, that experience is so important because then I was like, oh, this is what safety feels like. Now I know what it feels like. I can look for it in a different way. Yeah.
Beautiful. I think
Mhm.
that's a great note for us to wrap up on.
I know we could probably talk for 3 hours about this. Sorry.
We could talk for days about
It's
this.
real.
And I really appreciate that folks on Instagram have been sharing a lot of supportive comments. Haha, yeah, let's save the world. Folks wanting to like be able to send a recording of this to their loved ones later. Yes, absolutely. There will be a recording that you can check
Yeah.
up on, and a lot of encouragement, people telling us to keep it up. So yeah,
Who
yeah,
knows? Maybe we'll create some other resources from this because this is an exciting conversation. I love having this conversation. So yeah, let's figure
yeah,
it out. Let us know what you want, people. Like it's like,
yeah. Let us know what
yeah.
you think about this conversation and what
Hmm.
you're curious to know more about. I have a workshop coming up on non-monogamy in your nervous system on March 9th, which, if you want to get
Yay.
started, is a great opportunity to come and explore that. And all my work kind of focuses around this realm of somatics and non-monogamy.
Yeah.
Um, and Alex, where can people find your books, your work?
Yeah, absolutely. You are welcome to check out my Instagram, which you should find very easily if you're on Instagram Live, and look at the link tree. And my website is very foundable as alexantaffi.com. And I just have a new book out with Mac John Barker, How to Understand Your Relationships. And we do bringing various things, including a more somatic approach. And I'm also really excited, like Mel and I are, I'm sure, are going to continue talking and connecting and because yeah, I've never had a colleague who's like really done, the somatic kind of experiencing training and also brings this lens. So it's very exciting to have this conversation. So, but yes, you can find my work on my website, and I also have a newsletter that you can sign up for so that you know what I'm up to.
I love your newsletter.
Thank you.
I always get excited when I see it in my inbox.
That's great. I was like, oh yeah, probably have to figure out what I'm writing for the next one. I usually really connect to the moment. I send it out on the full moon by and large, unless there's a new offering that I want people to be aware of. And it's just a beautiful opportunity to sit down and reflect on something in my life and then share with others. And it's been really beautiful to see how it resonates for others as well.
Thank you so much, Alex. And thank you, everybody who joined us on Instagram Live today.
Yes,
I'm going to end the video there and we can stay on Zoom and chat a little bit more.
absolutely. Thank you,
Um,
Mal, and thank you, everybody. I really appreciate you all.
one thing that, just to kind of reemphasize, if we're considering this
Mhm.
like maybe this is the extra features on a podcast or something,
Yep.
there's something as well about, recognizing what are all the other obstacles to that ventral vagal
Yes.
connection,
Hmm.
because there's all these real obstacles in our relationships and feeling that relational safety. But of course, there's also obstacles in our physical being.
Yes.
And like I mentioned to you when we talked before, like I've had a few clients who've had like traumatic head injuries
Hmm.
and they really struggle with emotional regulation. And we know that that can be a thing from traumatic brain injuries, but anything that impacts the spine, that impacts around the neck, but also different nervous system conditions like dysautonomia, like anything that's impacting the way the nervous system can regulate could potentially, it doesn't necessarily, but it could potentially have an impact on the way that someone experiences compersion, jealousy, scarcity, attachment, and all of that. And when people think like, oh, it's just in your head, like I think that sometimes gets a bit dismissive. It
Yeah.
kind of it plays into that gaslighting. And I think there's something important to recognize of like there can sometimes be something in the body and we may not know what that is or how to address that yet, but I think just recognizing the reality of that. So many people are experiencing long COVID and don't realize that what they're experiencing is long COVID. Like I've heard stories of
Absolutely.
people being diagnosed with like full nervous system shutdown and things like that. And I'm like, well, that's a symptom of long COVID. And the more times you've been exposed to COVID, the more damage happens to your nervous system.
Absolutely.
And
Hmm.
it's only the researchers who are researching it who know that at this point, and the people who have the condition who've learned this. But the I think it's something that we're going to be contending more and more with, especially with bird flu coming up. I
Hmm.
mean, we're understanding more about how post-viral syndromes impact the nervous system because we see that with chronic fatigue, with myalgic encephalomyelitis. I know people who developed post-viral syndromes after H1N1 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we're going to see something more coming out with that with bird flu, and um, that in the midst of the world, the state of the world, climate change, fascism, fall of empire, economic crisis, everything. It just feels like there's so much poignancy to doing this work at this time.
Absolutely. And I think that kind of, in a way, brings back that piece about white supremacy, right? White supremacists wants us to be, and colonialism wants us to be disconnected from our bodies, right? Go harder, faster, you know. You have the flu, take this pill, and then you get over the flu faster, right? Or you don't feel well, take this other pill, do this thing, and then you'll be able to function under capitalism, right? And so I think it's really important to talk about this because, for example, if you're talking to a partner or even if you're trying to connect your own feelings and you're sleep deprived, right? Or it's like 10 o'clock at night and you're tired, or you are hungry because you're not really meeting the needs of your body in terms of food, right? If you are not drinking enough water, if you're not moving your body, you're not connecting with others, right? All the things that we know as embodied human beings we need. And it's
Mhm.
so hard to meet our needs under those very basic needs under capitalism.
Yeah.
Already that brings a state of activation. And then on top of that, when you put like neurodivergence, it takes me a little bit more to process new information. So if I come across some new information, my first response might be dysregulation, and I might need a partner to have patience for my second response, right? I'm going to be like, okay, I'm dysregulated. I need to go what I need to do to take care of myself, process the information, and then come back with a regulated response and not have that first response weaponized, right? Especially if the new information, for example, was happening like at a time where already I'm like, oh, I haven't even had breakfast yet, or it's bedtime, right? That's going to maybe lead to a meltdown. And that's not necessarily my authentic response. It's just like my nervous system is kind of all over the map and I need to settle, right? And then, like you said, traumatic brain injury is another layer, like long COVID. As somebody who's got hypermobile EDS, I know how much the connective tissue, right? I have a not super stable spine. And so stuff is literally
Mhm.
pushing on nerves in my spine that's sending information to my brain. So, and often we're flooded with adrenaline because of the
Yeah.
nature of the connective tissue, right? So that's going to impact mood. It's going to impact response. And how can we find grace with ourselves and one another where we don't expect ourselves to be perfect at all times? And when there is a rupture, we don't go into, I've done something wrong, I'm a bad person, but hey, there's been a rupture. What is happening? Oh, I was hurt and you're hurt. Let's understand each other
Yeah.
and let's take this moment, as a way to deepen into our relationship, deepen into our friendship, deepen into our partnership, deepen into our knowledge of one another as humans, right? And I think there is a lot of ignoring the physicality in every way, right? And so all of those are also conditioned for regulation. And we're already living a body that tells a lot of us to be smaller, right? And more control. And so already that we might be impacted also by like disordered eating. We might be impacted by just not having enough time to take care of our body mind. And we might be always pushed to our limits of our body minds for survival. And that's not going to be conducive to somatic compersion. I mean, that's not even conducive to basic living, honestly, for most of us. Like, I'm like, let alone compersion. I was like, most of us feel like, I don't know, I feel like I'm just the last few years, like I'm just on this runaway train and I'm holding on for dear life, right? And I know
Yeah.
a lot of other folks feel that way too. I mean, somatic compersion is beautiful, but how hard is it to access it? Because, like you said, it's innate, but how can we access it when our basic body mind needs might not be met for all the reasons we talked about? I don't know. Does that make sense?
Oh,
Or
yeah. Yeah. And again, it comes back to this piece of the obstacle to compersion is colonialism, is white supremacy, is these systems
absolutely,
of dominance and power that leave us feeling like we have to be small to
yes,
survive, or that we have to be grandiose to assert ourselves to survive,
yeah,
and doesn't leave a lot of space or any space really for equity, for ventral
yeah.
vagal relationality. Um, yeah, I feel really grateful to just be in this conversation with you about these things, and especially in this time in the world. And we see so many people getting flooded by the overwhelm, like the kind of shock and awe
Mhm.
thing that's happening in the media and with political actions. And the confusion that's created with AI stuff, and um, the to get back to basics in a way of like, how are we resourcing safety? How are we
Mhm.
resourcing this in a practical sense? How are we allowing ourselves to take that experience in so that we can really feel it deeply in our bodies, in our soma, and then allowing that to be the foundation that we move through relationships with?
Absolutely. And and just to add to that, also, how can we discern between like discomfort and lack of safety, especially when there is so much activation, right? And especially when maybe whiteness hasn't helped us discern the difference between I'm a little bit uncomfortable with I'm unsafe, right? Because even a little bit of discomfort can easily tap into I'm not safe. And also there's so much discourse also around relationship. And I love social media, don't get me wrong. I mean, I'm on social media all the time. I'm very vulnerable main all the time. And also there's a lot of like, this is how you do relationship, right? You don't know anything to anybody, if it's like there's a lot of like rules and cut and dry and that also relationships are so nuanced and messy. I don't know. One of my nesting partners I've been with for like 25 years. My bestie was just visiting. We've known each other for nearly 30 years, right? We've known each other longer actually than each other's like partners. And relationships are not static, like you said, right? We've gone through so many different versions of ourselves and of our relationships. And there has to be some spaciousness for that, right? If we want things to stay the same and grab onto things like, and, with our hands closed and just like grab onto them for dear life, then we suffocate them. And that includes our relationships. And compersion is the opposite of that, I think, right? Somatic compersion is the opposite of suffocating our relationship. It's like, oh, wow, our relationship is taking like a deep breath.
Yeah.
And I can feel the expansion and beauty of that deep breath between us.
And I'm noticing even your movements as you're doing that, right? That
Yeah.
we've got that contraction of like the smallness, the the feeling unsafe, the feeling insecure,
Yes.
right? We pull everything in. And I feel that too, when I don't feel safe, or when I feel
Mhm.
um the sense of stability is not there in a
Yes.
relationship, I can feel that contraction. I didn't used to be so aware of it before I did somatic experiencing, but now it's very loud, even if it's very subtle.
Mhm.
And I think, noticing that, like, is this just discomfort? Is this because this is something new? Or is this because I am actually not safe? There's a whole bunch of discernment. I think, we
Yes.
somatics, we talk about coupling dynamics, and I think there's a lot
Yes.
that like gets condensed because we just don't have enough experience being resourced, being supported to engage with the unfamiliar, so we just kind of collapse it all into the unfamiliar is unsafe. But as soon as that, even just the potential for compersion comes along, as soon as a partner has shared with me what's happening, I've noticed that even if there is a sense of discomfort, like I might feel a tightness around my solar plexus or my stomach, there is also a sense of expansion. There is also a
Yes.
sense of something in my chest releases and opens, and there's a little more breath coming through my back. There's a little bit of slowing down. There's a little more curiosity. Sometimes that slowness goes into immediate fastness because I want to know everything more. um, but these experiences can be simultaneous. Like
Mhm.
I can feel the discomfort of newness and the unfamiliar, and I can simultaneously be connected to there is a sense of something more that's happening here.
Absolutely. And when you were talking about that, I was like, oh, the thought that rose for me was also like the conditions for somatic compersion are also healthy interdependence, which is
Yes.
very much about like, right, decolonizing and re-indigenizing, like, because if you know, if I feel like I have to be completely independent or completely dependent, right? And there is this push and pull, it's me or you, right? In terms of survival, I cannot experience that somatic compersion, right? But with healthy interdependence, I know I'm not only connected to like my partner, but I'm also connected to this broader mycelium. And so now I'm feeling that compersion maybe for my partner and my metamor, and also how all of us benefit, right? And so really, in a way, somatic compersion interdependence is both the soil from which somatic compersion can arise, but then it also returns nutrients to that soil, right? It's like a cycle. So I feel the healthy interdependent web between us. Somatic compersion grows from there, and then the somatic compersion feeds that web of interdependence in the mycelium.